The year 2025 marks a moment when tensions between Canada and the United States rise to unprecedented levels. In this climate, Prime Minister Mark Carney is quietly but decisively steering Canada away from its traditional orbit, paving the way for new alliances and new centers of power. At the same time, in the heart of the vast Sahel region, a completely different generation of leadership is emerging, bolder, tougher, and determined to shape the future on their own terms. Ibrahim Traoré has become the symbol of that movement, and it is the convergence of these two paths, both breaking away from old dependencies, that has led to a handshake that stunned the world. Ibrahim Traoré and Africa unexpectedly forming an alliance with Canada. This is not an ordinary agreement, nor is it a superficial diplomatic gesture. It is a signal, a declaration sent directly to Washington and to the old order. The ties that once held nations trapped in their past are no longer strong enough. But immediately, a crucial question emerges. Is a still developing continent like Africa truly ready to become a strategic partner for Canada? And can this cooperation remain stable under pressure from major powers? To understand more, hit like and follow the next developments in this unfolding story. Canada's unexpected strategic shift did not emerge from thin air. It was born from years of unresolved tension with its southern neighbor and from a global environment where old alliances no longer carry the certainty they once did. After a series of trade disputes and tariff escalations under Washington's changing administrations, Ottawa began to recognize a truth that many nations have learned the hard way. Relying on a single market, even one as large and influential as the United States, comes with consequences. Prime Minister Mark Carney understood early that the era of economic comfort was fading. The 21st century would not reward nations that stood still. It would reward nations that diversified, adapted, and rebuilt their strategic independence. And so, a quiet but profound recalibration began inside Canada's economic institutions. The term supply chain diversification, once confined to academic papers and policy roundtables, became a national narrative. Businesses were encouraged to explore non-U.S. markets. Provincial leaders received briefings on alternative trade corridors. Diplomats were instructed to identify emerging partners, especially in regions previously overlooked by G7 capitals. At the same moment, a very different transformation was unfolding across the Atlantic. The Sahel, long burdened by instability, foreign intervention, and economic dependence, was undergoing one of the most dramatic political realignments in modern African history. Nations like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso were no longer willing to accept decades of external oversight. They were asserting sovereignty with a conviction that startled European policymakers. France, once the unquestioned power in the region, saw its influence erode almost overnight. Military agreements were cancelled, development programs were restructured, and a new doctrine emerged among Sahelian leaders: dignity before dependency. This shift resonated strongly with populations that felt ignored, exploited, or dismissed by the international system. Amid this upheaval, a rising figure captured global attention, a leader whose voice carried the determination of a generation tired of compromise and coercion. His speeches challenged old powers, his policies rejected external control, and his vision for the Sahel was built on uncompromising independence. Western analysts began to warn that the region was moving out of the Western orbit, a phrase repeated in reports from Harvard analysts, Rand Corporation research groups, and policy briefings circulated quietly within Washington. It was precisely this changing geopolitical climate that positioned Canada and the Sahel on a collision course, not of conflict, but of opportunity. Carney's search for new economic partners aligned with the Sahel's desire to break free from traditional spheres of influence. Both sides shared a common motivation: to loosen the grip of long-standing dependencies. For Canada, this partnership offered access to a region rich in natural resources, youthful demographics, and untapped markets. For the Sahel, it provided entry into a G7 economy that had no colonial past in the region and no record of political interference. In other words, Canada represented something rare in global diplomacy, a major power without historical baggage. Washington monitored these developments with growing concern. Internal memos from U.S. Strategic agencies began asking the same question: what happens if Canada becomes the new gateway for African integration into G7 markets? Such a shift would dilute America's long-standing influence, weaken its economic leverage, and potentially inspire other nations to pursue independent alliances beyond Washington's reach. This was not hypothetical fear. It was a strategic calculation. The United States had benefited for decades from being the primary destination for Canadian industry, labor, and exports. Any attempt by Ottawa to diversify, even symbolically, challenged the stability of this relationship. And when that diversification extended toward a region undergoing one of the boldest assertions of sovereignty in modern history, Washington's unease became unavoidable. The foundational conditions were now set: Canada seeking independence from U.S. economic pressure, the Sahel pursuing liberation from European dominance, and global institutions acknowledging a significant shift in the balance of influence. But while the geopolitical context alone was enough to raise eyebrows in Washington, the real turning point came when these two forces, Canada's search for autonomy and the Sahel's push for sovereignty, merged into concrete, highly visible cooperation projects. And that cooperation would unfold in three unexpected sectors: tourism, wine, and automobiles, each one more disruptive than the last. But those were only the first signals of a deeper transformation, because the real shock to Washington began with what came next. The first shock did not come from factories, minerals, or military declarations. It came from something far more symbolic and far more powerful: the sky. When Canada quietly approved experimental direct flights linking Montreal to Ouagadougou and Toronto to Bamako, most observers assumed these were merely seasonal routes, aviation tests, or diplomatic gestures. They were wrong. These routes were the beginning of a corridor, a soft power bridge, connecting a G7 nation with a region the West had long considered unstable, unprofitable, or strategically irrelevant. For many Canadians, the idea of flying directly into the Sahel would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. For many Americans, it was beyond imagination. But for Ottawa, these flight paths carried a meaning far deeper than tourism. They were the first step in reshaping the geography of influence. The symbolism of this move was unmistakable. A direct flight removes barriers, it removes intermediaries, it removes dependence on European transit hubs that once acted as gatekeepers for travel into Africa. For the Sahel, it meant recognition, a validation of its growing autonomy. For Canada, it meant the freedom to craft foreign policy without waiting for Washington's approval. This aviation corridor mirrored a strategy Canada once applied with Caribbean nations, creating stable, repeatable travel routes that bring people, ideas, and investment closer together. In global politics, nothing strengthens a relationship faster than physical connectivity. Once people start to travel, they spend, build, invest, and return. Culture follows. Trade follows. Influence follows. But Ottawa did not stop with airplanes. They went deeper, committing an estimated 200 to 300 million Canadian dollars into tourism infrastructure across the Sahel. The projects focused on ecological conservation zones, protected safari corridors, and sustainable hospitality areas where Canada possesses both expertise and international credibility. Canadian engineers began surveying potential ecotourism reserves. Hospitality institutions in Quebec and British Columbia opened exchange programs tailored specifically for young workers from the Sahel. Investment groups in Toronto began assessing the feasibility of high-end eco-lodges designed for affluent travelers seeking pristine, untouched destinations. For Sahel governments, this was revolutionary. No G7 nation had ever invested in tourism, not extraction, not mining, not security, but tourism in this region. Tourism is the language of respect. It acknowledges the land as beautiful, not merely exploitable. It invites partnership, not oversight. In response, Sahel nations offered something unprecedented, a new visa category, named by local officials as the African Golden Tourist Visa, granting Canadian citizens special access, long-term stays, and tax benefits for Canadian businesses operating inside approved tourism zones. Alongside this, 15 major resort and eco-lodge projects led by Canadian investors were granted tax exemptions, fast-track permits, and protected land allocations. For a region often criticized for bureaucratic rigidity, This level of facilitation was unprecedented. For local communities, these investments brought hope, jobs, training, and the chance to redefine their countries beyond narratives of conflict. Young people who once saw migration as their only future now received opportunities to work in hospitality sectors modeled after Canadian standards. The emotional impact was enormous. Dignity through work, pride through cultural recognition. For Washington, however, the deeper meaning of this partnership was troubling. Tourism may appear harmless, but in geopolitics, it often serves as the opening act of long-term influence. A nation that builds hotels will eventually build supply chains. A nation that opens air routes will eventually open diplomatic hubs. A nation that trains workers will eventually shape values, networks, and loyalties. American analysts began to identify the pattern. Canada was establishing a strategic foothold in the Sahel. The Sahel was choosing a G7 partner that was not the United States, and the United States was losing the soft power competition in a region where it had never fully engaged. The Pentagon issued internal warnings that Canada's tourism expansion could evolve into permanent logistical corridors, serving trade, development initiatives, or even future peacekeeping missions. The U.S. State Department expressed frustration. The United States had spent years attempting to build influence in West Africa, yet Canada had achieved more goodwill in months than Washington had managed in decades. Policy experts in Washington think tanks released quiet but sharply worded reports. They warned that if Canada became the new gateway for integrating the Sahel into G7 markets, the United States would lose bargaining power not only in Africa, but also within North American trade dynamics. U.S. Aligned media outlets framed the partnership as reckless, premature, or strategically naive. But beneath those criticisms lay something simpler: fear. Fear that the United States was no longer the sole destination for rising nations seeking partnership with the Western world. This was the moment international observers realized Canada was no longer behaving like a secondary power. It was acting like a nation ready to assert its own foreign policy and expand its own sphere of influence, a move that directly challenged Washington's long-standing leadership in the region. And for the Sahel, especially its younger generation, it meant something even more profound: recognition, partnership, and the first step in breaking free from a century of external control. If you believe that the courage of emerging nations deserves recognition, I invite you to share your thoughts below, because what happened next would make Washington even more alarmed and push this partnership into territory no one ever expected. If the tourism agreements caught Washington off guard, the next development shook both Paris and the American agricultural lobby. Few expected that wine and industry, long dominated by France, Italy, California, and Australia, would become the center of a geopolitical shift. Yet that is precisely what happened when Canada announced a pilot program to import wines from Sahel nations into its state-controlled liquor system. To understand why this mattered, one must understand what wine represents in the global market. Wine is not just a beverage. It is identity, culture, prestige, and power. Nations compete for market share because wine exports are tied to diplomacy, tourism, and national branding. For decades, France held near total dominance over West African taste preferences, while the United States relied on Canadian consumers to support its expanding wine industry. Ontario's Liquor Control Board, LCBO, and Quebec's SAQ were among the largest buyers of American wine exports outside of Asia. This is why the announcement hit like a bolt of lightning. Across the Sahel, something unusual was unfolding. Climatologists began noting that certain regions of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger possessed microclimates suitable for heat-resistant grape varieties, the same varieties being tested in Australia and southern Spain. The agricultural ministries of these nations saw an opportunity to build a domestic wine industry strong enough to replace French imports and compete internationally. This movement was cultural as much as economic. For generations, African beverages had been dismissed or commercially ignored. A Sahelian wine grown on African soil by African farmers, bottled by African companies, would mark a new chapter in self-determination. The symbolism was powerful, and Canada saw potential where others saw risk. When Ottawa allowed Sahelian wines to appear on LCBO and SAQ shelves, two of the most influential retail systems in North America, It was not just testing a product, it was testing a narrative. Could a region overlooked for decades produce something worthy of standing beside French Bordeaux or California Chardonnay? Canadian officials framed the decision as diversifying consumer choice. But analysts immediately understood the deeper implications. This was access to a G7 market, a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem of importers, distributors, sommeliers, and restaurants. No African wine industry had ever received such endorsement from a major Western nation. Wine experts predicted that if the Sahel succeeded, it could disrupt supply chains that France and the United States had relied on for decades. And for Canada, this was not altruism. It was strategy, building new partners without political baggage, where Canada could play a shaping role from the beginning. But what truly surprised global competitors was the second layer of cooperation: technical training and agricultural support. Canadian agronomists, particularly from Alberta and British Columbia, began working with Sahelian farmers to introduce drought-resistant grape varieties and improve irrigation. They assisted with cooling technology, fermentation control, and vineyard management. These were the same innovations that helped Canada transform its own wine industry from a domestic novelty into an internationally recognized producer. To France, this felt like a threat to its historical monopoly. To the United States, it signaled a potential loss of market share. But for the Sahel, it was liberation, freedom from dependence on imported wine, and from the perception that only Europe could define what quality meant. Local communities began seeing real changes. Agricultural cooperatives received new equipment. Young agricultural students traveled to Canada for training. Small vineyards once thought impossible were now producing bottles submitted to international competitions. The emotional impact was profound: pride, ownership, and a sense of stepping onto a global stage that had long been closed to them. As Sahelian wines appeared on Canadian shelves, international media responded with a mixture of surprise, skepticism, and curiosity. French commentators called the move unusual and politically provocative. American agricultural groups warned that the United States could lose more than a decade of market growth in Canada if the trend continued. But the political implications ran much deeper. For the first time, a G7 nation was proactively strengthening an African industry that directly competed with European and American producers. This was not humanitarian aid. This was partnership. The Sahel was no longer being taught to depend on former colonial powers. They were being empowered to challenge them. Washington's concern was immediate. If Canada could elevate the Sahel's wine industry into Western markets, what would stop it from supporting the Sahel's agriculture, textiles, or manufacturing? Analysts feared a domino effect that could pull African economies away from the influence of France and the United States. Even within Canada, the initiative sparked controversy. Supporters saw it as visionary, a chance to lead in emerging markets. Critics worried about backlash from the United States, Canada's largest trading partner. But Carney remained firm, emphasizing that diversification was not anti-American. It was pro-Canadian. His message was clear: Canada must prepare for a world where economic security comes from many partners, not just one. That stance resonated with Canadians who had witnessed tariffs, trade disputes, and political volatility from Washington threaten their industries. It also appealed to young Canadians who viewed Africa not as a region of crisis, but as a region of opportunity. What shook Washington most was not the wine itself, but its meaning. Through tourism and wine, Canada was building influence in the Sahel faster and more effectively than any U.S. initiative. And it was doing so without military bases, without political conditions, and without the historical burden of intervention. The realization was painful. The United States was losing the soft power race in a region it had underestimated for far too long. If you believe that courage, sovereignty, and opportunity deserve to be recognized wherever they emerge, leave your voice in the comments. Because the next phase of this partnership, the automotive revolution, would push Washington from concern into outright alarm. If tourism reshaped perceptions and wine disrupted markets, then the third pillar of the Canada-Sahel partnership struck at something far more sensitive: North America's industrial power. The automotive agreement was not only unexpected, it was unprecedented. For decades, North American car manufacturing followed one simple rule: production begins in the United States or Mexico, flows upward into Canada and integrates into a tightly controlled supply chain within the U.S. Canada-Mexico corridor. But everything changed when Canada quietly announced plans to open an automotive assembly center, not in Ontario, not in Alberta, but in Burkina Faso, deep within the Sahel, under a framework negotiated with emerging regional leaders, including Ibrahim Traoré. This single move signaled a complete break from decades of economic orthodoxy. The decision stunned policy analysts. No G7 country had ever shifted part of its automotive production chain to West Africa. Yet Canada saw an opportunity the rest of the world had overlooked. The Sahel offered vast land, inexpensive labor, and governments actively seeking industrial partnerships free from the political constraints of Europe or the United States. The facility planned for Burkina Faso would focus on hybrid vehicles and light-duty trucks, two product categories with rising demand in the Canadian market. Canadian engineers would oversee quality control, while Burkina Faso would provide the workforce and the industrial environment. Local leaders hailed it as a national victory, signaling that the era of exporting raw materials and importing finished goods was coming to an end. For many in the region, this partnership represented dignity, an industrial awakening after years of underdevelopment fueled by external dependency. For Burkina Faso's youth, it was a chance to enter an industry once considered unreachable, a chance to build vehicles that would travel Canadian roads and serve Canadian families. To understand why Canada made this bold leap, one must look southward. Under newly imposed tariff frameworks and protectionist measures introduced by Washington, including tariffs ranging from 10 to 25% on essential automotive components, Canadian manufacturers were facing rising costs that threatened their competitiveness. For Canada, remaining within a U.S.-centered supply chain meant absorbing economic shocks driven by every political cycle in Washington. Breaking away meant survival. The Sahel offered a solution, a location beyond the reach of U.S. tariff regulation, and a partner willing to offer generous incentives in exchange for long-term industrial investment. Under the leadership of figures such as Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso offered terms that included 10 years of full tax exemption for Canadian automotive operations, land designated specifically for a Canada Sahel industrial zone, streamlined permitting and legal guarantees that would take years to negotiate in Western economies, access to regional supply chains, positioning Burkina Faso as a manufacturing hub for the entire Sahel. It was a mutually beneficial partnership. Canada gained lower costs and supply chain diversification. The Sahel gained industry, jobs, and international legitimacy. The next development became headline news across North America. Vehicles assembled in Burkina Faso, using components from Canada, Japan, and Asia, would be re-imported into the Canadian market at prices 30 to 40% lower than comparable models manufactured in North America. The consequences were immediate. Canadian consumers would save money. Canadian dealerships would gain new revenue streams. But U.S. automakers, especially Ford and General Motors, faced an existential threat. Ford executives privately warned that such imports could erode their market share in Canada. GM analysts noted that once foreign-assembled hybrids enter Canada at scale, U.S. leverage over the North American automotive supply chain would weaken permanently. For Washington, the fear extended far beyond automobiles. This partnership represented something deeper. A G7 nation was building a supply chain independent of U.S. control. A rising African bloc, led by figures such as Ibrahim Traoré, was gaining direct access to Western markets. U.S. influence in Africa, already eroding, was being bypassed entirely. Washington think tanks issued urgent briefings, warning that if Canada and Burkina Faso succeeded, other African nations might align with Ottawa instead of Washington. This possibility was echoed repeatedly on platforms analyzing Africa's geopolitical rise, often cited in African news-related discussions. European diplomats viewed the automotive shift as evidence that Canada was emerging as an independent geopolitical actor, no longer living in the shadow of U.S. policy. Asian partners quietly welcomed the move, noting that Canada was embracing a multipolar world. In Africa, especially in Burkina Faso, public enthusiasm surged. Media across the continent celebrated the agreement as proof that African nations could become exporters of finished industrial goods, not just raw materials. For the younger generation, especially those who admired Ibrahim Traoré, this was a moment of pride, widely shared across Africa, news networks and local radio. What worried Washington most was not the economic shift, but the psychological one. Canada, a nation long seen as America's closest and most predictable partner, was signaling that it no longer accepted the role of a junior ally. Ottawa was choosing a future shaped by global partnerships, not geographic dependency. And with every new announcement, from tourism to wine to automobiles, one reality became increasingly clear. The United States was gradually losing its ability to shape the destiny of its closest neighbor. If you believe that leadership and sovereignty matter, whether in North America or Africa, share your thoughts below. Just when Washington believed it had fully grasped the scale of the Canada-Sahel partnership, a fourth revelation emerged, one that transformed the relationship from strategic cooperation into a geopolitical rupture. It did not come from factories or trade routes or private negotiations. It came from something far more symbolic and far more devastating to the established order: a formal declaration of a Canada-Sahel economic security framework, a binding agreement that elevated the partnership into an international alliance with long-term political weight. This was the twist few had predicted. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before Parliament and announced that Canada would designate the Sahel as a priority strategic partner, a status typically reserved for major powers or long-standing allies. In diplomatic terms, this was an earthquake. It placed Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger on a tier far above what Washington considered politically acceptable. In the same statement, Carney highlighted the leadership emerging from the Sahel, naming Ibrahim Traoré specifically as a central figure in the region's transformation. Within hours, media networks across Africa, especially channels associated with Africa news, were filled with clips of the announcement. Young people in Burkina Faso celebrated publicly. Many described the moment as the first time a G7 nation recognized the Sahel, not as a zone of crisis, but as a center of future growth. What made the framework shocking was its structure. Canada committed to protecting shared supply chains. Sahel nations committed to granting Canada unparalleled industrial access. Both sides agreed to jointly develop manufacturing zones, energy corridors, and trade routes. An oversight committee would be co-chaired, one seat held by Canada, one by Burkina Faso. For Washington, this was unthinkable. A G7 nation had elevated a region viewed by the US as unstable into a geopolitical equal, and a leader repeatedly portrayed in Western media as anti-West, Ibrahim Traoré, was now overseeing a shared economic governance platform with a G7 partner. This was not just cooperation, this was institution building, this was power sharing. The United States was not simply losing influence in Africa, it was losing influence over Canada. For over 7 decades, U.S. strategists assumed that any major Canadian foreign policy would align automatically with Washington's interests, but this framework shattered that assumption. Canada was no longer acting like a junior ally. It was acting like a sovereign geopolitical actor, willing to redefine global partnerships, even at the expense of American preferences. Internal reports from the Pentagon, leaked to the press, revealed language rarely used in North American diplomacy. Canada is diverging strategically. The Sahel partnership represents a structural realignment. Washington can no longer assume Canadian alignment in Africa policy. As coverage intensified, something remarkable happened. Ibrahim Traoré's name surged across Western media, not as a symbol of instability, but as a symbol of rising influence. For the first time, U.S. audiences saw him not merely through the lens of security briefings, but through the lens of strategic partnership thanks to Canada. Africa News published editorials describing the partnership as a new axis of autonomy. Canadian newspapers featured opinion pieces calling Traoré one of the most consequential African leaders of the decade. And in Burkina Faso, crowds gathered in Ouagadougou to celebrate what they called the return of dignity, the moment their country became a recognized player in the global order. The twist was not simply that Canada elevated the Sahel, It was that the Sahel, through leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, elevated Canada as well. By aligning with a bloc unbound by traditional Western expectations, Canada positioned itself as the first G7 nation to fully embrace multipolarity. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso gained unprecedented access to advanced technology, capital, and political legitimacy. Both sides became stronger, both sides became more independent, and the United States suddenly found itself confronting a truth it had long denied. In a world reshaped by new alliances, even the closest partners can choose their own destiny. If you believe the story of rising nations deserves to be heard, share your thoughts below and stay with us. As we reach the end of this story, one truth stands clear. A new chapter has begun both for Canada and for the nations of the Sahel. What started as simple cooperation has evolved into a vision of shared destiny, where a G7 nation and a proudly sovereign African bloc stand shoulder to shoulder. And at the center of this transformation is the rising leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, whose determination has carried Burkina Faso from the margins of the global system into the heart of international debate. Across Africa, platforms like Africa News now speak of a continent that will no longer wait for permission to define its own future. And across Canada, citizens are witnessing their country step forward with a confidence the world has not seen in decades. The message is unmistakable. Nations rise not when they are invited, but when they choose to stand. And as Ibrahim Traoré himself declared, "We do not ask for permission to be free. We stand and we claim it." If the spirit of Burkina Faso, the courage of Ibrahim Traoré, and the awakening carried through Africa News speak to your heart, share this story. Subscribe to join a community that believes truth matters more than headlines. And may a stronger, freer Africa continue to inspire the world.